We've been talking about the importance of worldview and how each of us has a worldview through which we look at the world, understand the world, and it is our worldview that will determine the kind of society that we build. Another way of looking at this is to say that ideas have consequences. I found this illustration of a tree to be particularly helpful to people. A tree has roots, and the roots of the tree correspond to the belief system of a people. Then you have the trunk of the tree, and the trunk corresponds to the values that are derived from that belief system. What is good? What is bad? What is beautiful? What is ugly? So the value system comes from the belief system. The values, the trunk, leads to the branches of the tree, which is the behavior that comes from the value system. And then the fruit of the tree, the fruit is the outcome of the behavior. Ideas have consequences. If in a culture we believe that men are superior to women, we have that value that male is superior to female, that causes men to behave in a certain way and women to behave in a certain way. And that behavior has consequences. And as we looked at earlier, we now have 200 million fewer women alive in the world today. They're dead. And they're dead because someone killed them. It could have been a doctor in a sex selection abortion. It could be a midwife at the birth. It could be a husband killing his wife. But you have dead females to the extent that there are 200 million fewer women in the world than there should be. Why? The fruit comes from the root, the belief system that produces the value system that male is superior to female. The next thing that we want to see is that ideas spread. And they spread in three ways. They spread around the world, then they spread through time, and then they penetrate culture. And I'd like to look at each one of these for a moment. First of all, ideas spread around the surface of the world. Jesus in Acts chapter 1 said, "We are to be His witnesses in Jerusalem, in Judea, in Samaria, and to the uttermost corners of the world." Here, ideas are to move horizontally around the surface of the world. And the church understands this today. We have a real sense of wanting to see the gospel move around the world, and we are in what some people call the final frontiers of missions, taking the gospel to unreached people groups in very remote places. And the mission thrust has moved outwards around the surface of the world. The next way ideas travel, they travel through time from one generation to another. And often today, as Christians, we're not as conscious of the need to engage in this multi-generational experiment. But the gospel is to go from parents to children and children to grandchildren. It's to move from one generation to another. I was in the Ukraine a number of years ago, and after this session, a student came up to me, a woman came up to me, and she said, "Darrow, I have an illustration for you." She said, "I love to make roast beef, and all my friends love to come to my house to have roast beef." And one day, one of my friends said, "What is the secret of your roast beef? What do you do to it that makes it so special?" And she thought for a moment, and she said, "Well, maybe it's because I cut the end of the roast off before I put it in the pan and roast it." And the friend said, "Well, why do you do that?" And the girl said, "Well, I don't know." And she thought for a minute, and she thought, "Well, that's probably because that's how my mom did it." So her girlfriend said, "Well, why did your mom do it that way?" She said, "I don't know." "Well, next time you see your mom, ask your mom why she cut the end of the roast off." And so when she saw her mother later in the week, she said, "Mom, why did you cut the end of the roast off?" And the mother said, "I don't know. That's just how Grandma did it." "Well, why did Grandma do it that way?" "Well, I don't know. She just did." So the next time she saw her grandma, she said, "Grandma, why did you cut the end of the roast off before you put it in the pan?" And her grandma said, "Because I had a very small pan and couldn't get the roast in it, so I had to cut the end off." "Well, why do we do the things that we do?" "I don't know. It's just because that's how my father did it, or my grandfather, or my mother, or my grandmother." And very often we live unexamined lives. We do things almost as if we are a programmed machine, as opposed to an image bearer of God who is wrestling with ideas and thinking about the reasons we do things, and thinking about where ideas come from and the impact they have on our lives. So ideas move from one generation to another, and if they are good ideas, then we are blessed by those ideas. But if they're not good ideas, then we receive the burden of those bad ideas. The third way ideas travel is vertically. They penetrate culture. We see this in Matthew chapter 28, where Jesus tells the disciples to make disciples of all nations. You're all familiar with this passage. Matthew 28:19, "Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey all that I have commanded." The gospel is not just to go around the world, the gospel is to penetrate culture. And this is something that the church has largely forgotten today. We've been so focused on the gospel going around the world that we have forgotten that it is to penetrate culture. So when you read the Great Commission, and Jesus says, "Therefore go and make disciples of all nations," this is the vertical impacting of ideas, for ideas to penetrate culture. How do ideas spread through culture? They usually begin with the intellectual in the university. These are the men and the women who love to wrestle with questions and ideas. They're not afraid of questions. They spend their lives asking them and looking for the answers. And they are the ones who work in our universities and teach from this body of knowledge that they have gained through their wrestling with ideas. Usually what happens next, the ideas are picked up by balladeers. These are the artists, the filmmakers, the songwriters, the singers and musicians and poets. And they are very sensitive people. They usually are the ones that hear the ideas coming before anyone else, and they take and put these ideas into their artistic expression, and the ideas begin to go from there into the culture. They begin to shape culture. The professionals are the ones who pick this up next. These are the doctors, the lawyers, the architects, and they take the ideas that are now part of the popular culture and they create laws and build institutions and structures in society that reflect these ideas. And then we live within the framework of these ideas. And then last, of course, is the common man and woman in a society, and whether the laws are just or corrupt, they are the ones that pay the price for the laws and structures that have been created. So ideas move around the world, they move through time, and they penetrate culture. And it is the penetration of culture that we largely as a church have forgotten. We have seen the Great Commission as going into all the world, preaching the gospel, saving souls for heaven, and maybe planting churches, but we have not seen the gospel as discipling nations. What does it mean for the gospel to penetrate culture? I'd like you to reflect on that.